Está ligado? Não, está desligado. Ok, fantástico.
So, the title of my paper, The 300 Spartans in the City of God, alludes to two well-known cinematographic references from popular culture. The one from The 300, the American epic war movie based on the comic series of the same name by Frank Miller and Lynn Valley. The other from City of God, the Brazilian crime film based on the homonymous novel by Paulo Lins. Besides their common origin in popular culture, these references would hardly seem to share anything whatsoever. The one deals with King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who faced the Persian god king Xerxes and his invading army of more than 300,000 soldiers in 480 BCE. The other depicts the growth of organized crime in a Brazilian suburb between the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 80s. The oddity of these allusions, however, intends to suggest a somewhat deeper connection and structure underlying their historical periods and situations. In order to advance this suggestion, as well as the interest in comparing such at first incomparable things, I would like to quote very famous words by Walter Benjamin's 60 Theses on the Concept of History. Articulating the past historically does not mean recognizing it the way it really was. It means appropriating the memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. Historical materialism wishes to hold fast that image of the past which unexpectedly appears to the historical subject in a moment of danger. The danger threatens both the content of the tradition and those who inherit it. For both it is one and the same thing, the danger of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. Every age must strive anew to wrest tradition away from the conformism that is working to overpower it. So in order to try to wrest tradition away from this kind of appropriation, I may not read the past the way it really was. And when I presented this paper in Brazil, a lot of classicists kind of questioned me if I was doing the proper thing towards the past. And well, I think I may have a bad reception here as well, as if I'm doing the right thing towards the present. And this kind of issue, and this kind of proposition may, well, find resistance in both fronts, I think. But I think it's worthy to present this comparison in order to make things, well, more clear, I think, in a way. So in Sparta, the full citizens were a minority that was called the homoioi. In Greek, in ancient Greek, the equals. While the majority was made by the ones in charge for working the land and caring for livestock, and they were called the helots. This name means the conquered ones, and it alludes to their enslaved condition, according to which they had the lowest social status and a perpetual task of providing the Spartan masters with everything they might need. The social structure developed in Sparta was responsible for highly reinforcing her militaristic tendencies. The main values defended by the elite class, as they were interiorized by the members, were closely associated with discipline, virtue in battle, and self-sacrifice for the city. The Spartiates spread these ideals as a common soil of the people, worthy of being considered equals, that is, of the full citizens of Sparta. At the same time, however, they reinforced their equality by way of opposition through comparison with the helots' inferiority. Taking into account some ancient testimonies about Spartan attitudes towards the helots, one may understand the social-cultural strategies developed to seclude, control, and abash them throughout so many centuries of slavery and humiliation. And in order to save some time, because we have a very short time of presentation, I will not read these passages. They will come in the print form shortly, I think. But anyway, these testimonies all present the way the Spartans tried to reinforce their identity in actually opposing them against what would be the improper way of being a citizen, that is, being a helot. And in order to do that, they kind of essentialize the characteristics of Spartans in one sense and the characteristics of Helots on the other. And the paroxysm of this trend leads to the reality of a very brutal practice established in Sparta and alluded to many of these testimonies. That is, the Crypteia is a kind of a secret police that had the possibility of killing the Helots with absolutely no responding towards the law. It was a way of controlling the populations, and this testimony by Plutarch clearly states that. I'm not going to read it to save time, but, well, it's projected. And anyway, I believe this text here projected clearly suggests the way Spartans saw Helots during the classical period, and probably before and after this time also. Social practices and prejudices have very long-term patterns that are difficult to change or recreate. The idea of declaring war annually against the Helots is in agreement with the ambiguities inherent to the Helots' position in Sparta. And here is my 2 points. Because the Helots were the main source of labor to provide society with subsistence, but at the same time they were regarded as the lowest and most despicable people of all. They were considered inferior people, but at the same time, they were treated with the harshness in order to keep their inferiority perpetually so. The existence of such a brutal and secret institution as the Crypteia, an institution constituted by the most insightful Spartan young men of military age, is a manifest indication of the deep tensions running through that society. If it would seem paradoxical that the status of these young soldiers, the Crypteia, was not so different from the one of the Helots, since so many of the Spartan practices were shared by both of them, this paradox would encapsulate the hidden truth that constituted the structure of this society. That is, the Helots were not inherently different from the Spartans. This difference had to be created and reinforced through many social practices. So passing to Brazil now, in these countries it is possible to suggest that there is, as in Europe I think, three main divisions that structure the social arrangement of the society, with a minority as an elite and a large number of people as lower class, comprising the low workers and what Gessé Souza, a sociologist in Brazil, calls the scum, well, with guillemets, with aspas. Between them, there is also a considerable number of middle-class people. Even if the names of these social divisions may have varied throughout Brazilian history, the proportion of its constituents and the structure underlying their relations were roughly kept unaltered from the colonial times up to the present republic. This social arrangement is a result of the Portuguese invasion, conquest, and colonization of large territories in South America. This long process of exploration starts with an immense genocide of indigenous peoples and the continuous sequestration of African populations, all of them enslaved in order to provide cheap labor to exploit the soil and its raw materials. These facts shaped Brazilian history and society, being inherently related to innumerable ills that haunt its institutions to the present day. The problem of this colonial heritage had never been properly faced by Brazilian authorities, and as a result, the same structures of oppression are constantly being restored under new names. In other words, since this primordial act of genocide and slavery have never been discussed and elaborated as a public question, Brazil still preserves a genocidal and slavery policy. In any case, when slavery was formally abolished in this country in 1888, no measure was taken to propose the division of the fortunes accumulated by the slave-owning classes or to assure the real insertion of the freed slaves in the job market. It comes as no surprise that this moment saw the formation of the first shanty towns in Brazil, with masses of people starting to build their houses in uninhabitable and undesirable regions. In any case, the great amount of labor concentrated in these shanty towns cheapened the costs with low workers, allowing the concentration of fortunes in the hands of a few, while deepening the misery of the majority. This situation constituted, and constitutes up to the present day, one of the main pillars of Brazilian society. In order to reinforce the social arrangement, the ruling class adopted a series of measures to ascertain their own values of law and order against what they considered the savagery and disorder of the lower classes. These measures involved eugenic policies as well as criminalization of popular practices of African matrix. Amongst the outlaw practices, one may mention, for instance, capoeira, samba, umbanda, and candomblé. This public persecution of popular practices and beliefs, generally of African origins, had practical implications upon the life of thousands of people, and it resulted in secluding, controlling, and abashing them. The greatest problem, however, is that this public project operates even today. The attempts to criminalize funk and the actual criminalization of the Brazilian typical graffiti, called pichação, are the clearest examples of this policy. As one of the effects provoked by the adoption of such policies, one may count deep segregation of spaces and cultures. The image of a split city operates with its full force in many Brazilian centers and in no other place with more visible consequences than in Rio de Janeiro, where the militarization of public security plays a terrible role in maintaining the same old structures of oppression. The fear of a popular uprising oriented still the behavior and strategy adopted by the police in dealing with the lower classes. According to José Souza, killing a black person has never been a problem in the eyes of a racist society like the Brazilian one. The genocide practices employed by the government have the support of considerable portions of the population, especially from the high and middle classes. With the excuse provided by the politics of the war on drugs, imported from the US in the 70s and 80s, it became easy to declare war on drug dealers, criminalize inhabitants of shanty towns, and justify any number of abuses committed in the name of this war. The paroxysm of this trend leads to the reality of a very brutal institution established in Rio de Janeiro and nowadays in other Brazilian centers as well, that is called BOPE, Battalion of Special Police Operations. That is a battalion of military policemen charged of ostensive operations comparable to SWAT. I will not read the testimony given by one of them recently in a book, recently published, but it's a very brutal institution indeed, and they are actually quite conscient about the questions involved in their policy.
You have time. You have a lot of more time.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
You have a lot of more time.
Because I was...
You have time.
Okay, thank you. The insanity of this civil war in Brazil, besides stipulating a perpetual state of exception with all its dire consequences for the poor segments of the population, becomes even clearer when it is noted that black men wearing black kill and are killed by black men. And that is a quotation by Marcelo Freixo, a Brazilian politician, and a very sensitive politician towards this kind of question, since BOPE is mainly composed by poor people, normally black, and who are in charge to deal with black populations and just to actually give away to this genocide with a very paradoxical nature indeed. The most part of the policeman notices and comprehends the absurd of this situation, and here I'm basing myself on this book, Tropa de Elite, or Elite da Tropa, the name of the book, since they understand their ambiguous role in society as both guarantors of the civil order from the perspective of the higher classes, but as perpetrators of the civil oppression from the perspective of the lower classes. They also understand the complexities of this arrangement, but as I said before, social practices and prejudices have very long-term patterns that are difficult to change or to recreate. The policy of war on drugs, and also against the inhabitants of shanty towns associated with criminal activities, is in agreement with the ambiguities inherent to the lower classes' position in Rio de Janeiro and in Brazil. And here I just repeat the same thing I've said about the Spartan society. Since the black people in Brazil, they are actually 54% of the population. They are the main source of labor to provide society with subsistence, but at the same time they are regarded as the lowest and most despicable people of the society. Well, implicitly, because that's not actually said. The prejudices in Brazil, they are most actually a lot more veiled than in North America, for example. And at the same time, they are considered inferior people, but at the same time, they are treated with harshness in order to keep their inferiority perpetually so. The existence of such a brutal institution as the BOPE, which actually became quite famous with the Brazilian film Tropa de Elite, and of military police in general, because BOPE is just a small unity, but the military police is a very harsh indeed, is a manifest indication of the deep tensions running through that society. If it would seem paradoxical that the social class of the policeman is not so different from the poor people oppressed by the state, this paradox would offer the opportunity for an important reflection. Brazilian people ought to stop the civil war in order to investigate the real interests behind it. Some ways by which this objective could be attained might include the legalization of drugs, as it has already started with success in many countries around the world, the demilitarization of police, and a gradual abolition of the penal system. Perhaps the comparison with ancient Spartan society and history may suggest a way that Rio de Janeiro and Brazil could employ to deal with the problems of deriding the same people you depend upon, or of humiliating these very same people you fear the most. After the Spartan defeat in the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, a considerable amount of helots revolted against their masters and founded another city for them. The foundation of Messene was made possible by a vigorous affirmation of their cultural values and practices in order to mobilize its people for the struggle towards social liberation. Having this paradigmatic solution in mind, I close this text quoting the words of a Brazilian black woman whose work has been important for many of the considerations suggested here, when she says, "We change nothing, absolutely nothing by ourselves. As we learn with the black feminist thought, with the teachings of our ancestors, empowerment is something that we build together. There is no possibility of overcoming the shackles of so profound a structure of oppression, like racism, without a collective struggle." And, well, that's pretty much what I had prepared for today. We can discuss some parts of it, some details if you like to, but that's it. Thank you.
Portanto, no vamos poder facer a ligación. Foi unha edición exclusiva para ti. Por iso vamos abrir os comentarios e depois facemos unha pausa no programado para tomar café. É isso.
So, thank you. There were two more speakers. He is not coming, and the other one, who was already on Skype, is now going to the airport. I don't know why, but...
It's coming here.
Oh, it's coming here, so...
Yeah, she's coming.
She's coming. Maybe you can find a slot for her later. Okay. So, this means that we have plenty of time to discuss Rafael's proposal. And I was informed that you will have unexpected coffee break, which was not scheduled, but it's always good. And if I may, before opening the questions to Rafael, which I hope you have it, I'm going to make some provocative remarks on it, okay? So first, let me tell you that it's with great pleasure that I'm here coordinating this, chairing this panel. I've worked on security over the last 10 years from different perspectives, on CCTV technologies, on urban security, and over the last years I'm studying security in the most exquisite place for some people, which is the prison. And I was very interested in some remarks Rafael brought us here today, because the problem of racism is not exclusive to Brazil. We have different forms of racism in different parts of the world. This being said, the problem of racism in Brazil is serious, but my first question is related with the word genocide. Do you think we may use the word genocide to explain what happens in Brazil today? Because I'm not sure that would be, I'm not going to say politically correct, but it's not, in my perspective. When using the word genocide to speak about Brazil, we are really undervaluing genocidal situations that happened throughout our history and that are continue to happen nowadays. So this is maybe just semantic, but as social scientists, I think we need to be very careful with these words and the concepts and the history underlying it. Maybe, as I said, these are provocative questions, but I think this is the right place for doing it. Okay? So, related with this question, you have BOPE, and we have military police, which is very powerful in Brazil, contrary of what happens in Portugal, for example, in terms of police forces. But let's use the word genocide. You use it. Is this against whom? The poor? The black? Because to use the word genocide, you have to have, you need to have a target. Yeah. No? Is it the poor? Because if it is the poor, it doesn't matter if it's black, white, or blue. It's a matter of poverty. Is it the black? Are the favela inhabitants? What is this warfare about? Okay? And, of course, it is related with the war on drugs. Okay. What kind of relations would you do with the North American racism that aims or that have such prominence regarding black people? You know that the majority of prison inmates are black, whatever. So are we talking about genocide or active discrimination and racism and segregation, whatever? Okay? Cheers.
Well, Katarina Frois, thank you very much for the questions. Very provocative indeed, but as my field of specialism is not actually the social reality of nowadays, I was kind of surprised as well when I came to the word genocide being used by sociologists in Brazil to describe the situation. But I understood the option to do that because when we see the numbers, the Brazilian population is made of 54% considered black, in general. But the people in prison are about 77% black. So there is already a kind of a difference in the imprisonment politics involved with race. And the mortality levels among black people are very, very high indeed when compared to even white people poor. They are about 70% of the mortality among young people from 18 to 25 people, they are black. So these are amazing numbers, well, sadly amazing numbers, because it shows that even if genocide may be a too harsh word to be used here, there is a kind of a genocidal policy being employed by the government and the society in general. Nowadays, with the occupation, with the military occupation in Rio de Janeiro, we are seeing a very strange images and very strange sequences currently, every day. For example, people being shot and eventually being rescued by the police who shoot them, and people of middle class and high class going to the streets and asking the policemen to kill them. And that's just amazing, because people are not ashamed to do that in front of the cameras and so on. So, well, I understand that it's very difficult to stipulate when a genocidal situation starts and when it's a harsh way of racism. Brazil is in between these poles, I think, but it's difficult to say if it's only about prejudice or more than that. So I understand the rhetorical strategy of the people who study this kind of issues in Brazil in order to make uncomfortable, I think, the government and the people involved in security, for example, because many of them are black. And so when you talk about genocide, and well, I think it at least make these people reflect. About the idea of who are the target of the police, or who are the target of the hygienic policies or eugenic policies from the Brazilian government. I think, of course, the poor are the main target. If you live in a favela, your life is less valuable than if you live in a middle-class neighborhood. For example, during this operation, this military operation in Brazil, the commander in charge, he expeded a license to the police invade large numbers of the neighborhoods without having to ask to the judge, for example, to have a mandado, yes, exactly, to arrest people or to invade domiciles. But as I said before, even if the poor are the main targets, when you are poor and black and homosexual and woman, well, there are levels and levels of fragile situations. So I think, well, poor is the first level, then or inhabiting in a favela and being poor and being black and being homosexual, and so these are kind of labels that make your life tough and tough and tough. But of course, the poor are the main targets of the eugenic policies or hygienic policies. And relating to the American racism, there is a lot of work being done nowadays, since a lot of feminist thoughts and black thought are being published in Brazil from the America. For example, from Angela Davis, who is becoming quite famous amongst Brazilian sociologists. But it's difficult to just compare the two situations, since there are too many similarities, but at the same time the differences are very, very deep indeed, because in Brazil there is a common sense thought that we have a racial democracy. That's a Brazilian expression from, well, sociologists from USP, that Brazil kind of resolved the prejudices in a non-institutional way with miscegenation and misogyny, which is actually absolutely untrue, because the way racism works or operates in Brazil is much more veiled, I think, than in North America or in US, and because of that it's much more difficult to combat, in a way, because people just don't admit. There is a recent research that has been made when they asked people in the streets if they were racist themselves, and 97% said no. But when asked if they knew a racist people, 99% said yes. So the question was, where are the racists? They are all hidden home. And that's a big problem, because if there is racism but people don't admit they are racist, it's difficult to combat that. And well, that's one difference, I think, from the North America, because in the US you can go to the streets and have a supremacist a riot or something, and that's not a crime. In Brazil, I think that would be treated as a crime. So, well, there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. So, yeah. Yeah, you deal with imprisonment, and you know much more than me that in North America, as in Brazil, well, this politics of imprisoning people is a way of controlling market questions and the issues of capital, and well, I think that's a way of comparing the two forms of racism. I think.
Say that I don't agree with those kind of theories. Otherwise, I would say that we live in a crazy, crazy world where you lock up people because you have too much unemployment. So, okay. So, are there questions to Rafael? Don't be shy. Hello.
Hello, morning. It's not really real. Well, I'm an architect, so I'm not a social scientist. So I'm just looking for some clarifications, probably enlightenment. So I was just wondering. I mean, if the main target are poor people, or if the main target are favela inhabitants, and picking up from what Katerina is saying, can you really associate BOPI with the practice of genocide against black people? So isn't there a sort of mistake in correlating these two entities, right? Because the target seems to be, as you said, mainly inhabitants from favelas, and probably within them, black people are more targeted than white people.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but still, I mean, yeah, that was one of the things I would like you to clarify. Yeah, if you agree or not with that. And I was in Maré with a friend of mine that works there. I mean, in an NGO for many years. She's from Rio. And I mean, we could see the drug traffickers for sure, and we could see BOPI working there, but we could also see, I mean, I couldn't see, but she was explaining me about the role of militias. And I would like to understand, how do you, if you actually integrate, you know, militias within your work, and how, and what is the relation between, you know, precisely racism, genocide, BOPI, and these land mafias or infrastructure mafias that maybe are, I don't know if they are blind to race or not.
If they are?
Blind to race or not.
Okay.
Right? Also.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. there is a thing that Angela Davis talks about in her works, that is the idea that in places where slavery was a common practice, it is impossible to not relate race with social issues from being poor or being rich or, well, your social class. So, of course, the main targets of the police, for example, they are poor. But at the same time, the most part of the poor people in Brazil are black because of this heirdom from the slavery. And that's a very problematic situation since, as I said, since the abolition, we haven't absolutely discussed the idea of, for example, redistributing land or redistributing property, since these people were released in a way, but absolutely with nothing, absolutely nothing. So they were the first inhabitants of the shanty towns, of the favelas, which started in the beginning of the 20th century, and the policemen. As I said, I use here these two books, Elite da Tropa, to make my comments, but there are a lot of more researches which I've consulted, but I haven't brought here, which show the idea of the policeman, even the black policeman, being absolutely prejudicious against black people. And I haven't read this extract, but I'll read now since we have time. There is something written by these three men, Batista and Pimentel. They were former BOP officers, and Soares is a sociologist, a social researcher. And he says, with the BOP, there is no adjustment, there is no business, and it is not to brag, but we are the best urban warfare troop in the world, the most technical, the best prepared, the strongest. It is not me who is saying, the Israelis come here to learn with us, the Americans too. This quality is due to many factors, one of which is this: nowhere in the world can you practice every day. We are about 150 men, approximately. Whenever we wanted to increase this number, it went wrong. It is not easy to join the BOP. This I can guarantee. It is not for everyone. We have a fucking pride of the black uniform of our symbol, and of our symbol, the knife nailed in the skull. The crooks tremble in front of us. I'll not deceive you. With the crooks there is no appeal. At night, for example, we do not take prisoners. In the night raids, if we run into a bomb, he goes to the ditch. I know this policy was not correct. Now there is no way. We kill or die. Well, that's not actually the extract I was looking for. Sorry for that. Where is it? Oh, it's here. I haven't translated this one, so it's in Portuguese. Well, does everyone understand Portuguese? Because no. Okay, because I think I can't translate directly. But so you have to take my word. He's being racist. Well, the people who understand Portuguese follow me. He is again the same authors saying, não vamos ser cínicos e fingir que vivemos no paraíso da democracia racial. E não estou falando só porque sou negro e vítima do preconceito, não. Milhões de vezes me pego discriminando também. Na hora de mandar descer do ônibus, você acha que escolho o Mauricinho louro de olhos azuis, vestidinho para aula de inglês, ou o negrinho de bermuda e sandália? E não venha me culpar. Adoto o mesmo critério que rege o medo da classe média. É isso mesmo. A seleção policial segue o padrão do medo, instalado na ideologia dominante, que se difunde na mídia. Não é jargão marxista, não. Depois eu conto, porque lhe posso assegurar que não tenho nada a ver com marxismo, comunismo, essas coisas. So, you see, well, they operate within these racist paradigms, and they are conscient about it, because actually these kind of works, because if you just start to treat everyone likewise, you are much less efficient from the police perspective than if you just operate within this these racist paradigms. So it's a very difficult situation indeed, because the policemen, they know that. Sometimes they are black and they operate more effectively against black people. Well, it's very difficult indeed. And about the other question, militias, the second book treats a lot more about these institutions, since it is very recent in a way. It started during the 2000s, I think. And it has something to do with the way the police operates, the PM, the police militar, and the way some voids were made in favelas, cleaned from the drug dealers, and the way the police started to do the job the drug dealers have done for decades. So it's a much more complex and difficult situation, because now you have law and order operating when actually disorder was operating before. And well, for my comparison with the Spartan situation, this is totally out of the possibility of comparing, I think. Because in Sparta we don't have this kind of information, first of all, this kind of detail. And I think it would be very difficult to imagine something like that going on. But I would like actually to well, make my studies more profound into the idea of seeing or trying to understand the relation between militia and racism and this kind of stuff, because I don't have information about it. I would guess the militia operates within the same paradigms as the military police, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. I haven't read anything about it.
Any more questions? No? So, coffee.